In the autumn of 1475, Margaret of Anjou suffered yet another humiliation, just as she had so often in the preceding years. The widow of Henry VI was sold back to her home country, France, for a ransom of 50,000 crowns. Few events could have more starkly demonstrated her diminished significance. Only 5 years earlier, she had been one of the masterminds behind a plot that nearly cost Edward IV his crown, his family, and his life. One of her allies at that time was the French King Louis XI, who now paid for her return. Edward was so confident he had crushed her influence that he saw no issue in allowing his former enemies to reunite. The Yorkist king was correct. Margaret, desperate to return home, would soon discover that the worst was still to come for the former queen. Welcome back to Lemmy History. We don't usually deal with the last years of Margaret's life. The Queen's political life ended on the 7th of May, 1471. On this day, she and her faithful servant and friend, Catherine Vaux, were taken prisoner by the Yorkist troops. She had lost everything now. Her son was dead, and her husband was locked up in the Tower again. He was to follow his son 2 weeks later. She herself had lost her freedom. Yet her later life remains worth recounting and reflecting upon. Margaret's story powerfully illustrates how far even a queen could fall. Notably, while Edward IV treated her poorly, it was still better than the treatment she received from Louis XI. Once the pride of France and de facto regent of England, Margaret had become a symbol of disgrace in the eyes of the powerful men who once relied on her. Louis, who had mocked her even during her days of influence for her overly proud writing style, seemed to take particular satisfaction in reminding her repeatedly of her downfall. Even as she lay dying, she was forced to endure one final humiliation. Margaret's thoughts must have returned again and again to the fateful 4th of May, 1471. She had returned to England with her son Edward only 3 weeks earlier, after a decade in exile. She expected a triumphant reception. After all, her new ally, the so-called kingmaker Richard Neville, had succeeded in freeing her husband Henry from the Tower and restoring him to the throne. Their son, now 17 years old, was to act as regent for his father, before eventually becoming king himself. But the situation had changed dramatically while Margaret waited for her crossing. George, Duke of Clarence and brother of Edward IV, had originally also defected to the House of Lancaster. In the meantime, however, he had changed sides again after secret negotiations. He fought at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471, alongside his brothers Richard and Edward. The House of York was reunited and victorious. Neville had fallen, and Henry found himself once again in the Tower. The Lancaster army, in contrast, was divided. The troops under Edmund Beaufort and Jasper Tudor were far apart. Margaret and her son were in great danger the moment they set foot on land. The Queen, therefore, wanted to return immediately to the ships and flee. Her generals convinced Margaret otherwise. It was possible to unite with Tudor, who was mobilizing troops in Wales, they promised. Margaret believed them and would come to regret it. Edward IV had anticipated that his enemies would attempt to unite and rushed westward with 5,000 men. His brothers were at his side. The Lancaster troops around Margaret, her son, and Beaufort numbered 6,000 men, due to the reinforcements that had arrived in England. They were thus numerically superior, which made Beaufort and the other commanders, John Wenlock and John Courtenay, optimistic. However, they underestimated two critical problems. First, a large part of their army was demoralized after the defeat at Barnet and only partially ready to fight. Second, the Yorkist troops possessed far stronger artillery. The Lancaster troops reached Tewkesbury on the 3rd of May. It was decided that Edward of Westminster would fight. Margaret opposed this. The risk was too great for her only heir, but the military leaders persuaded her otherwise. Edward's presence on the battlefield, they argued, would help his cause and boost troop morale. He would be doing what Henry VI had never truly managed, and if the battle were lost, arrangements had been made for his escape. Edward would also stand beside the experienced Wenlock, who had already proven himself in numerous battles. On the evening of May 3rd, it became clear that the time for reflection was over. In the Lancaster camp, the noise of an approaching army grew louder and louder. Scouts returned with reports that Edward IV was only 5 kilometers away. Soon, the troops would be within firing distance. Margaret and her daughter-in-law at the time, Anne Neville, said goodbye to Edward of Westminster and withdrew to the monastery of Tewkesbury during the battle. It was so far from the actual battlefield that the women would not know who had won until they were informed. As we know, it was a farewell forever between mother, wife, and son, or husband, even if modern depictions mistakenly show Edward alongside his mother after Tewkesbury. The battle became a disaster. The troops observed each other throughout the night, but remained in battle formation. At daybreak, Edward IV ordered his artillery to open fire on the vanguard led by Beaufort. The force of the cannons compelled him to retreat with his troops. The aim was to reach Tewkesbury Park, regroup, and attack the Yorkist rearguard commanded by William Hastings. But Edward IV had planned for exactly this. He ordered his right wing to push Beaufort back and keep him engaged. The Yorkist right wing was commanded by Edward's youngest brother Richard, who visibly relished being at the center of the fighting. Beaufort and his men were trapped between a hill and Richard's troops. Then the trap snapped shut. Edward IV had held back 200 lancers previously hidden from the Lancaster army. They now attacked Beaufort's troops directly, causing a bloodbath. The Lancaster general tried to fight his way back to the main army with his men. Again and again, he demanded support from Wenlock. But none came. When Beaufort finally returned with heavy losses, he shouted at Wenlock for standing by idly. In a fit of rage, Beaufort is said to have killed him with his own hands. He suspected Wenlock of continuing to serve the House of York, which Wenlock had long done in the past. This delivered the final blow to Lancaster's army. Without a functioning chain of command, the troops disbanded. The men fled for their lives toward the church sanctuary of the convent, where Margaret awaited news. Many of the fleeing soldiers would not make it. They were slaughtered by York troops in a field that was later given the name Bloody Meadow. How Edward of Westminster died remains uncertain. According to Tudor tradition, he was captured and brought before Edward IV, who then killed him with his own hands. Shortly after the battle, it was said that Henry VI's son had fled the battlefield and been slain while trying to escape. Allegedly, he begged George to spare his life. According to another tradition, it was George who killed Edward of Westminster. Today, the version most widely accepted is that the former heir to the throne died while fleeing. For Margaret, the horror was only beginning. Beaufort and some of his men reached the monastery, now surrounded by York troops. The former queen likely learned of the battle's outcome this way, and presumably, she was also informed that her son had died. She herself had to assume that she would soon follow him. Together with Anne Neville and Catherine Vaux, she searched for a new hiding place within the monastery grounds in a desperate attempt to save herself. Edward IV waited for the time being, but after 2 days, he broke the sanctuary of the monastery church and had the Lancaster troops dragged out and taken to the village market square. 19 men were beheaded, Beaufort among them. Margaret was found shortly afterward. As the Croyland Chronicle reports, she did not have to fear for her life, but she suffered immense humiliation. Edward IV paraded her through London in his chariot as part of his triumphal procession. Meanwhile, Margaret's son had been buried by York troops. He received a funeral befitting his status. Margaret was taken to the Tower but was not reunited with her husband. She saw this as yet another humiliation. In retrospect, it seems more likely that Edward IV did not want her to interfere with the murder of Henry VI, which he had ordered, and which was carried out on the night of the 21st to the 22nd of May. At the time, she was still imprisoned in the Tower and must have understood what was happening. Edward IV had chosen to take bloody revenge on his enemies. We do not know whether he ever considered killing Margaret as well. Instead, she was moved from the Tower to Windsor. In 1472, she was transferred to Oxford and placed under the supervision of Alice Chaucer, the widow of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The two women had once been close friends, but the Chaucer family had long since aligned itself with the House of York. Alice's son, John de la Pole, was married to Edward's sister, Elizabeth. Margaret now found herself in the care of a woman who had gone from friend to enemy. While Margaret was still isolated, Edward gradually relaxed the conditions of her imprisonment. He paid for her upkeep and allowed her to have servants once more. Catherine Vaux resumed her traditional position. She had lost her husband William at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where he had fought on the side of Lancaster. Margaret received clothing from the Crown, almost exclusively black. Eventually, she was allowed to return to London, join a guild devoted to the worship of the Virgin Mary, and use Edward's own chapel. We can only infer from these privileges that Edward IV no longer regarded her as a threat. The woman who had once brutally suppressed uprisings and ordered executions was, in the king's view, apparently broken. And by all appearances, she no longer served as a rallying figure for remaining Lancastrian sympathizers. If they still existed, their loyalties had shifted to Henry Tudor, then in exile in Brittany, but being actively pursued by Edward's agents. The king saw a teenager, who was in truth a political nobody, as a greater threat than Margaret. That, too, must have been painful for her, especially since Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had submitted to Edward IV and sought compromise with the king. Margaret Beaufort had always revered Henry VI. The matriarch of the future Tudor dynasty evidently did not feel the same way about his wife. It was a painful reminder that Margaret had always faced resistance, even within the Lancastrian ranks, where many resented the extent of her power as a woman. Without a husband or a son by her side, she no longer commanded the loyalty of the barons or their wives. Margaret was convinced she had done everything, sacrificed everything, and lost everything for England. And this was her reward. She was entirely at the mercy of her enemy. For that reason, she wished above all to return to France. England was done with her, so Margaret of Anjou was done with England. In November 1475, Sir Thomas Montgomery was entrusted with the command of a sensitive prisoner transport. His charge was to escort England's former queen back to France. The circumstances could hardly have been more symbolic. She had first arrived on April 9th, 1445, as a beautiful young bride who seemed to promise a new era of peace for England. Yet the weather during that initial crossing was so severe that her ship lost both masts. She reached her new homeland sick and exhausted. Now, she left England as an old and broken woman in the autumn of both her life and the calendar year. This time, however, the weather was favorable. Her return to England in 1471 had also been delayed by storms, delays that may well have cost her faction the victory. Margaret of Anjou and the British Isles seemed fated never to belong together. Even so, the former queen was in good spirits. She was glad to finally return to her homeland. And this, despite the fact that the arrangement itself had been yet another humiliation. Not only because Edward let her go without concern, but because the agreement regarding her ransom had not been included in the official peace negotiations following the English invasion earlier that year. Instead, it was arranged afterward, as Paul Murray Kendall notes. The Queen was no longer significant enough for the main stage of diplomacy. This was further demonstrated by the fact that Louis XI missed 6 installments of the 50,000 crowns owed for her ransom, prompting Edward to send envoys to France. The French king evidently felt confident that his English counterpart would not escalate matters over Margaret. For her release, Margaret had to renounce not only all claims in England, but also any in France. Louis made no compromises on this point. He assigned her to her father's household and permitted her to bring only one servant from England, the previously mentioned Catherine Vaux. Margaret's father was the so-called Good King René, titular king of Naples, Sicily, and Jerusalem. He was thus often described, unflatteringly, as a man of many crowns, but none of a kingdom. At the time, he was in conflict with Louis XI. The king had seized 2 regions under René's control, Bar and the Duchy of Anjou. Louis offered René a pension in exchange for formally surrendering them. The Duke refused, but ultimately had no choice but to yield. At the latest, with his death, those territories would pass to Louis. Margaret had been more pragmatic than her father. She accepted a modest pension in return for relinquishing her claims in France. However, the sum was barely enough to sustain her. She could no longer maintain the lifestyle to which she had been accustomed. Even during her house arrest in England, her conditions had been more comfortable. She lived in her father's castle at Reculay, but given the ongoing conflict between René and Louis, she knew she would lose this residence the moment her father died. Her entire livelihood depended on him during this time. And yet, her father was no ally. Margaret had disappointed his expectations. He may even have held her responsible for his own misfortunes. Still, there is no record of an open dispute between them. Margaret was now forced to retreat from political life, something she was likely glad to do. However, there was one notable exception. She commissioned the Burgundian chronicler Georges Chastelain to write her memoirs, titled Le Temple de Boccace. The purpose of this work was to defend Margaret against the many unjust criticisms she had faced over time. Otherwise, she spent her days riding horseback, hunting, or walking through the forests of her childhood. If Margaret of Anjou ever experienced anything resembling peace, it may have been during this time. When her father died in 1480, Margaret was left so destitute that she had to rely on the charity of her servants just to keep a roof over her head. She moved to Dampierre, where she lived in a comparatively modest estate. Her financial situation was so dire that she was forced to begin selling off her remaining possessions, though there had never been much left to begin with. Little is known about her daily life during this final chapter. She sought solace in religion and in her memories. Margaret clung to a few remnants of her better days, delaying their sale for as long as possible. She spent much time with these personal effects, immersed in prayer. She also read frequently and continued to write. Among her writings was a will, composed on August 2, 1482, when she had fallen ill during the summer heat. Sensing that her end was near, Margaret named the king as her executor and made him her heir. She requested to be buried alongside her parents in the Cathedral of Angers. She also asked that her servants be looked after. In return, the king was to sell her remaining possessions, an instruction that was ultimately carried out. Before Margaret died on August 25th, she was forced to endure one final humiliation at the hands of the French king. Prior to making her will, she had gifted her hunting dogs to a neighboring friend, a person with whom she shared a close bond. In fact, the neighbor had once enjoyed a good relationship with the royal family. A decade earlier, she had even offered refuge to members of the royal household during a measles outbreak in the capital. But on August 12th, while Margaret was still alive, the king demanded the return of the dogs. He wrote to the recipient, "You know that Margaret has chosen me as her heir, and the dogs are the only thing I should get. They are also what I love the most. I pray that you don't keep any, or you would make me very uncomfortable." The message had its intended effect. Margaret was forced to witness, still alive, how a personal gift to a friend was reduced to a token of royal entitlement. At the very least, the king did honor her final request for burial. Margaret's long string of humiliations had finally come to an end. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help the channel.